Hello. I am excited to be able to share with you today. And I know my lighting is not the best lighting, but I hope that you will get something out of today's discussion. I have been posting for Black History Month various posts, and today I decided that I would just share in words rather than typing and writing something and to make it a little bit more personable. And I hope that those of you who watch these entries that I'm making are learning something, being inspired in some way, or at least I'm sparking some kind of curiosity that will get you to read a little bit more. One of the things about Black history that's special to me is remembering when we first started having Black History Month. And I can remember going to church and we would have Black History Month programs. But some churches still do this, but we really, in Mississippi, where I grew up, we did it up. We all had to do reports. Every young person had to do a report on a figure. And then we would have to get up and share those publicly. That's one of the traditions of the African American church that I think is being lost in what I call the Hollywood church. We grew up at a time where we had Easter programs, we had Children's Day, we had Christmas, but all of those programs require young people, and some of you will be familiar with Oprah Winfrey even talking about this, where you had these little poems that you were given. Every young person from age could talk all the way up to 18 were given these. And the older, of course, you were, the longer they were. But they were these poems that you recited and you did them from memory. So they would give them to us about 2 weeks, 3 weeks before the program, and everyone had to learn theirs. And then you had to get up in front of the entire church and recite them during this program. It taught us how to be comfortable speaking in front of people. It taught us how to l- remember things. Uh, those were good days for us because it created a generation of multiple generations of people who were very good at expressing themselves in different scenarios and situations. And I think that's one of the things that we got rid of sometimes in our giftedness thing that we started moving towards really in the 90s. I think we lost something there because we started saying, well, some people are not gifted in this and they're not gifted to do that. And so we started, well, we're not going to make someone do something they're not good at. Uh, the truth is, we only get good at what we practice. So by taking that away, now we have more and more young people who are not equipped to even talk one on one sometimes because we've not given them those opportunities in our Black church experiences that we used to have. So uh, there's a give and take there, but that's just my thoughts on it. I wanted to walk us through Black history a little bit differently than just naming who invented something or the name of someone who was the first Black person to accomplish this or to become that uh, in throughout history. There's other people who will be posting those kinds of things, and I think they're important. But I wanted to do my tributes this year a little bit different. And one of the things I want to talk about is the life of African Americans during these times of our history. Yesterday, I posted a bit of explanation about the early first and second generation of the first, what we would call middle class African Americans in the United States. And some of those families were people who were free people of color. Some of them had been slaves and saved up and bought their freedoms. Others of them were made free by their slave owners on their deathbed or as a gift of some sort for loyalty and different things like that. But by the time we hit I'd say middle pre Civil War, 1800s, we do see this emergence of these free people of color. Many of them, because of their connection to slave owners, sometimes they they would have been sent to Paris or to England for education because there were no schools in the United States that would have taken a person of color. So their family member, though illegitimate legally, their slave owner would have been probably their father, and he would have still wanted them to have some level of education. Uh, we don't know how all that worked in their emotional connections to the family, but a lot of those folks would have gotten educated and then come back and would have been given parcels of land, possibly not as much as the legitimate children were given off the plantation, but would have been given something so they'd have some type of independence and start in their lives. Uh, this setup created a tier in the race listings. We now, which I will get to, think of race, especially in terms of black and white. We think of white people, black people. They had a very complex listing of where you fit. Some of those terms we don't use anymore. They are considered offensive, and there's reasons for that, which I hope I can share a little bit of that too. But they would have had, first of all, whites at the very top, and then the next group would have been the mulattoes. Mulatto is from the Spanish. We get our word mule from this Latin background word. Mixed race, but they were not just mixed. Mulatto would have been half black, half white. That's the next tier. Then beneath them was the quadroons. This was those who would have been quarter black. I'm sorry, quarter white, three-fourths black. Then the next group would have been octoroons, the 1/8 white, and then the rest black. And then from there, you went to being what they would have considered black or Negro. Inside this tier, this created this hierarchical social construct. The prevailing idea, especially by the time we get to the later 1800s, with Darwinism coming on the scene in science, in his theory of evolution, but then there came this also alongside it was a concept of what they call social Darwinism, which basically believed that even humanity had hierarchy in the whites being the top, strongest, most brilliant, and then down the tier. So this created a social construct that basically said the more white you had in you, the more intelligent you were. But it also said that if you had black in you at all, which the Negro, even among the other races, Asian and Native Indian, or they would have said Indian, but we say Native American now, um, even putting those into the mix, the understanding was that the Negro was at the very bottom of the tier. So whatever white you had in you, the black would have dropped it down in intelligence until you were down at that bottom level. This created a different type of appreciation for what people of color was accomplishing at that time, because the prevailing view was that they could not learn beyond menial jobs, which is why there were debates. Should we put money into educating them with the liberal arts education if they're not even able to comprehend or understand or participate in the requirements of what those degrees would put them doing as labor in jobs? The other side to that also meant that people who would have been people of color, but at the top tier, which what we now would know to be biracial, half black, half white, they then became the progenitors or the next group to inherit. That's why when we look at old pictures from that period, a lot of the blacks, in some cases, um, and I'll show you a very important couple, which I probably do a whole video on them. He was our first elected senator. He was from the state of Mississippi, um, and his wife. They were a power couple for what we would call a power couple today, but Blanche Bruce and his wife were amazing in all the things that they accomplished as him being the first elected senator. But I want to show you their picture. These were considered people of color. They were black people, but if you notice, by our standards, we would not know that if we just looked at them, we would not say these were black people. But this is that mulatto class. This is that mulattoes, they would have been that higher class of people of color. This meant that they were also considered sometimes the most dangerous. Why? Because they could pass for white. When we read stories about someone passing for white, these are the people we're talking about. Now, they happen to be very proud of their black heritage. They considered themselves people of color. They considered themselves black. But there were so many that knew that the opportunities were limited. And if they really wanted to go far or move up the ladder of success, they would have been people who looked like them that decided to live their lives out as white people. Some of them would claim to have Hispanic, Spanish roots or French roots. They changed their name. This was before Social Security numbers, so you could just go to a new area and give a name and say, "My name is John Thibodeau," and people just had to accept that that was your name. There were no driver's licenses or anything like that, so people could change their identity quickly and easily, especially if they moved far from where anyone would have known their family. So we saw a lot of that during that period. But what these people would do is they became founders of schools. Howard University, Fisk University, often started by abolitionists in this class. So our historical black colleges often owes much of their existence to this group. These were also the first, in many cases, first teachers, first in the emerging freedmen schools, as they were called. They were not necessarily public schools. They were schools for children and adults who were coming out of slavery. These freedmen schools were set up by churches, civic groups, but the life of these folks was very difficult because they still had to toe this line. Among the black community, they were leaders. They were often aspiring people that you would look to as examples of the greatness, as W.B. Du Bois would call them, the great people of the race, the best of the best. And yet at the same time, they still dealt with discrimination. They were still called racial slurs. They were still not really part of the mainstream American class. This created for many of them the struggle of balancing their leadership and balancing their identity. So we sometimes kind of gloss over what life would have been like for them, even in cases where they were often accepted among whites as, you know, equals, if you will, if there was a such thing. It played out very differently for them because it was a volatile situation. They could be treated with respect, and then something happened and a white person gets offended by them, and just as quickly as they were raised and put into places of power, all of it could be taken away. And usually it wasn't just the individual who lost out, because these were also first blacks to get to do a thing. If they failed, often then it was like, well, we tried to use them, they weren't good at it, so now we're not going to use a black person ever again in this role, because obviously if we pull the best black person who went to Harvard or Oberlin College, or and they couldn't manage, why would we bring someone from Tuskegee or Grambling or one of the other schools that are black schools and put them in the same position? So that meant that they had very strict codes of how they interacted with one another, how they acted in public, how they who they associated with was very important, because they understood that they needed to keep the door open. So many of them learned way more than even their white counterparts at the time. They were people who would have learned six, seven, eight languages fluently. So that when white America would say to them, you can't be this or you can't do this or that, they would then have this ability to show, no, I really do. That's where, and again, I'm going to use some very harsh language to hear, but that's where the whole concept of the uppity Negro, they probably would have mispronounced that word and called it something else, but that whole concept came from white people who saw this group as a threat to their system of white supremacy, because these were blacks who were proving constantly that black people could do things and were able to learn and able to do all the things that the books were saying blacks could not do. This class of blacks were rising up and doing them. And so whether they were in cities or small towns, they were the first targets, usually of the terrorist groups like the KKK, later when the KKK formed, but even before they were the KKK officially, those terrorist groups, they were attacking this class of people: the business owner, the college educated doctor or dentist. Those were the folks who were being addressed by because they saw that they had money, they had influence, and the people with money and influence becomes the first threat. So they were attacked on all kinds of levels. But they also created for themselves a protectionary system that backfired in some cases, even in the African American community, because they understood association. Now, remember, we're Victorian era. Even in white America, the Victorians spent a lot of energy on this concept of you had to breed well, is what they called it. Were you well bred? That meant you came from good stock, good family name, married other good family name. If someone in the family did something that was immoral or unethical, the whole family name was now ruined. That's literally what that meant. And that meant no one in polite or acceptable society would date, talk, marry, or have anything to do with you anymore. Well, imagine being a person of color in that same type of world, because they were not in a bubble. They were all living in this world of these ideas. So that meant that if you were moving up, even as a person of color, who you married, the families you connected to had to also be families of good name and ethics and proper placement in their community. So out of that came organizations. That's how our black fraternities and our social clubs and things became a big deal, because it was a way for young people from good families to meet other young people from good families, so that they could make sure that they did not get caught up in a situation that would bring the race farther down than where they already were in the eyes of society. Now, that's hard for us who are very romantic in our worldview. We think in terms of you meet somebody and it doesn't matter where they came from, as long as they are doing the work themselves, that individualism thing. That was not a reality for these folks. And we have to look at their lives through the lens of where they lived and when they lived. They didn't have that luxury. So that often meant that because you're marrying of like mind, like culture, like thinking, it created almost a little small bubble of prospects for uh, progenitor, progenital connections, for having children, getting married, and all those things that go with it. That also meant that they wanted to make sure that everyone had the best decorum. Uh, so, how you spoke and how you dressed publicly, you had to show that you had the ability to mingle and move among the best of the white classes in order to show that you were not less than. Because any faux pas, any behavior outside of what was acceptable by polite society would, again, not only close the door for you, but could possibly close the door for a whole generation or more as these people were emerging and trying to move up in society and become part of the main successful society around them. Um, Out of them came two schools that, in many ways, are still debated. Uh, there were some things that kind of forced those schools to merge. Um, Early on, there was, do we spend money and energy on liberal arts, which is teaching Black people how to be thinkers and writers and learning music and history and becoming doctors and dentists and things like that? Or do we focus on economic empowerment where they do things that we know everyone will always need, and then they can make money, and in their ability to make money have this political power through their money? uh, this divided the Black community of the day into two camps. um, you had the W.B. Du Bois group that was more about educating and using the law, learning the law, and then using the law to push for freedom and equal rights. And then you had Booker T. Washington's side and those who supported his camp that said, no, let's use our financial empowerment thing as we get independent financially. Then when our buying power speaks, Washington, if you will, in the United States context, Washington will listen to us, because if we don't produce or we don't buy or whatever, because we now have money to buy things and money talks. The truth is, both of them were correct. There was a need for both sides of that. But at the time, the question was, which one do we do first? And there were heated debates between these two groups. And one of the things that I think, and I don't want to go too long, but one of the things I believe that pushed them to have to really talk about what they meant and what was important and how to work together in two fronts, understanding we're two sides of the same coin, and at some point there's going to merge into a middle ground, was 1896 Supreme Court decision, which legalized segregation. It legalized segregation across the nation. And when it did, it immediately had implications that were devastating for some people. Um, when you think about the Bruces, who were living in D.C., he was a senator, and then he was the treasurer. He was the guy who wrote all the government checks for everybody. He had a very good position, and he opened doors for people of color in Washington. But then he dies. She is still known as the senator's wife. They live um, on a in a what was then an emerging white. It was a white neighborhood when they bought their house, but now it's becoming more of these middle class, upper middle class blacks are living there, and whites, of course, move out as usual. But uh, everybody in Washington knew who she was. So when she would take public transportation, she just sat wherever she wanted. But now, segregation says that it doesn't matter if you're a senator, a former senator's wife, or not. And this is where we got rid of the mulatto, the quadroon, all of those things, because in 1896, the question came into who is now considered black. And what most states did is they identified that if you had a traceable black person in your heritage, that people living today knew your great grandparent or great great grandparent, and they are still alive, at that point, whether you had 1/8 white, it didn't matter. If you were 1/8 black, if you were all white with one black parent somewhere in your great great level, you are now considered a person who is black. So all of a sudden, we're not mulatto, we are black. Everybody. And it didn't matter if you had blonde hair, blue eyes. It didn't matter if you looked French. It didn't matter if you. So now this also created suspicions in the white community too, remember, because there have been so many of these people who have been passing. So now people started looking at features on folks. And if you had features that gave you almost a questionable look that there may be some blackness somewhere in your past, even white America may disown you from the group and the clubs and everything. So it was a really interesting time to live in because now everybody had to always try to prove their worthiness to belong into this white society. Um, but that also meant that people who had been able to live almost in a utopia of integration, because the mainstream blacks, what we call the masses, they still lived in the black quarters, they lived in black part of town, or they had a different life than this group. But 1896 meant that this group now has been devalued society wise to be now part of the masses of black America. And we'll talk later about what that looked like. But in many cases, it was also good for black America because now these folks get even more determined to make a difference in changing laws, because laws that only affected this group now affect them too. And that puts them, and they have the education and the finances in many cases to push for certain things to happen. So that's just a little bit. I hope I said this in a way that was inspiring and informative to you. And again, I wanted to just kind of delve more into Black history from the life of how people were really living and things that they were facing philosophically, more so than just this person and they accomplished this or that. So I hope you guys are enjoying this. Have a good day and many blessings.